Welcome to the Potboiler. I'm Patrick Hughes, and this is The Hero Business, Part 3. Potboiler is an old term for pulpy paperback genre writing that I believe deserves a new identity. Let's do the intro. Following Eric's brave intervention during an attempted robbery at her corner store, Molly insists on cooking him a home-cooked meal. Watching her work in his kitchen, Eric recalls the period of his childhood in the foster home of the Danvers family, led with images of the kind and maternal Mrs. Danvers and his impressive foster brother, Todd. His memories carry him through that formative period, the rise and fall of his brotherly bond with Todd, who guided him, protected him, and ultimately rejected him. The episodes of this story will be offered with no embedded commercial interruptions. Visit patrickhughes.ca for links to me and to my other projects. And please stick around after the story for some very light business. The Hero Business features excerpts from my novel, The Valiant Unheroic, available for order on my website. Now let's do the music. Enjoy. The Hero Business, Part 3. Chapter 6. Hello? Eric, are you here? She had already knocked 4 times when she tried the knob. His only visitor in 3 years before that day was a cat that had subsequently taken up residence. He wasn't opposed to guests, but from his comfortable chair on the balcony, he could barely hear the soft tapping at his front door. I've tried to imagine for a while what your home would look like. It had been 2 Thursdays since the attempted robbery of Molly's store. On the Thursday that followed, she promised she would find a way to thank him. On the Thursday that followed that, she suggested she'd cook him dinner. He found it peculiar at first to see her on a Saturday, but soon remembered their plans. I thought you were going to cook me dinner on Sunday. You're right. I'm sorry I couldn't call to reschedule. I don't have your number. She spoke as she busily unloaded her groceries on the counter. This is the only night I could get off. My sister Martha changed her plans on me. You don't mind, do you? He didn't. Eric's thoughts drifted from Molly's small talk, conversational chatter as he watched her culinary multitasking in action. She'd pulled an apron out of a grocery bag a minute before. He watched her effortlessly tie a perfectly shaped knot behind her back, fasten the apron tightly to her slender body. Her nimble movements around the kitchen, coupled with the domestic uniform, made her a perfect imitation of Mrs. Danvers. His concentration rolled and tumbled back into his old memories of his foster home. By his 7th birthday, Eric was moving to his 4th new home. The reasons varied for each move, and he understood none of them. He never felt rejected, and he believed the smiling counselors when they said his new home would be a better home. Early in his childhood, Eric was deemed to be the textbook case of autism. He was thought to be living in his own world as a result of his dispassionate response to those around him. government-sponsored child psychology meat grinder stamped the orphan with his dubious distinction, and the underprivileged child welfare wheels began spinning. Frustrated and inexperienced, albeit well-intentioned, host resulted in the first 2 failed homes. The generous families waned in their enthusiasm and reciprocated his lack of emotion and connection. His third placement and subsequent rescue became the result of an excess of emotion. Mary Ann Winter, Eric's child welfare counselor, received a phone call one morning from a concerned neighbor of the young boy's present foster home. The neighbor apologized for being nosy, but had heard a great deal of commotion over the past week. She had no evidence of abuse, but felt that the atmosphere of the household might be worth her immediate attention. Eric didn't react to Edgar Garneau's anger. In Edgar's house, that was dangerous. Edgar was by no means the stereotypical abuser. He was well-mannered, well-educated, and earned a fine income. But Edgar was unhappy. The sight of his home at the end of each day failed to bring him the warmth it should have. His own daughters and his wife knew how to cringe and cover. They had become accustomed to his verbal assaults. Eric looked straight into Edgar's eyes when he bellowed. Edgar had done some research on autism before Eric's arrival and had astutely determined that this kid was not autistic. His strained patience was convinced that his houseguest was mocking him with his fearless, empty gaze. Your own world. Bullshit. You can hear me. Yes, I can. The first time Edgar hit Eric, the repressed frustration bursting forth with his blow sent the 6-year-old clear across the room. His little head cracked against the edge of the oak coffee table. He stood up immediately and looked back at Edgar with a childish confusion. The lack of the expected, painful, cowering stimulus threw the man into a blazing fury. Nancy Garneau covered her eyes and whimpered as Eric pounced across the room. He grabbed the boy by his shoulder and heaved him into the direction of the front door. Get out, goddammit! Get out of my house, you friggin' freak! Eric flew forward, shattering a glass table as he fell. Again he stood up. Shards of glass fell from his clothing. His face and hands were expressionless, showing no signs of injury. The peculiarity of Eric's unblemished condition was lost in the rage and torment that filled the room. Edgar, for God's sake, stop! He turned and looked down at his frightened wife. She couldn't look him in the face, but her words cut through his ire momentarily. His eyes burned into her lowered head. Eric still stood at the far end of the room, hopeless to understand. Edgar's bellowing profanity left a trail as he stormed from the room and out the back door. Ms. Winter approached the Garneau residence with a smile on a sunny morning soon after, under the guise of a standard progress report. As her finger reached for the doorbell, a screaming match from inside rattled in her ears. Curiosity drew her around to the back of the house. She peered in through the kitchen window, and nausea viciously shook her stomach. The first image was of Nancy. Her left hand was behind her, bracing her weakened body against the counter, while her right reached out in front of her, fearfully then returning to cover her weeping face. Mary Ann's eyes followed the wife's expression. Cutlery, broken plates, and half-eaten meals were strewn across the floor. Eric sat in his chair, while the little girls fled from the room. Spaghetti sauce was smeared across the front of his sweater. His expression was its usual placid, looking at Edgar standing over him, his large hand wrapped around Eric's tiny throat. Edgar never hit anyone again after that day. Following a 6-month incarceration, a carefully prescribed regimen of antidepressant medication and therapy kept his anger under his control. His life was ruined and slowly rebuilt. Only a few years later, the Garneaus were a family again. Eric, what are you thinking about? It had taken a few minutes, but Molly noticed his mind was elsewhere. She was aware of her tendency to ramble on. I was thinking about Mrs. Danvers. You look like her. Oh, who is she? Her voice was soft and musical as she sat beside him, in the light from the open balcony window and the setting sun pouring in. I lived with her. She was my foster mother. Irma Danvers didn't know what to expect from Eric Verity. She had applied to be a foster parent a month previous to Eric's arrival. Her husband Ted worked long, late hours, and her eldest son, Barry, had little time left for her. She enjoyed the idea of a larger family and a playmate for her younger son, Todd. Irma was one of those mothers whose heart surrounded her household, and both her heart and her home had room for one more. Eric arrived on a Sunday in the springtime. Quiet rainfall in the early morning made everything glisten. The quiet suburban street was a shiny black, and the car's wheels made a moist sound that was soft in Eric's ears as they rolled into the driveway. This home will be better, Eric. He returned the appropriate smile to Miss Winter's promise as she exited the car and waddled politely up the driveway to a welcoming Mrs. Danvers. He soon sat quietly at the kitchen table, perusing his quaint, knick-knacked surroundings while the two ladies stood before him, exchanging pleasantries and information that he chose not to follow. He caught some mention of his schoolwork, but quickly diverted to the television sounds from the living room. Oh, he's doing quite well in arithmetic and memory retention skills. This, of course, is commonplace with his mild level of autism. You enjoy school, don't you, Eric? His head stayed turned toward the living room. Eric? Without acknowledgement, he slid from his chair and started for the living room. An awkward giggle fluttered between the two women. Eric entered the large room still holding his little suitcase. His eyes probed. Falling on the boy, slumped into the couch, looking back. Hello, the boy said, sounding uninterested. Hello, returned the boy's tone from Eric, keeping his stare. Wanna sit down? Yes. My name's Todd. His eyes now remained fixed on the animated screen. He stuck out his right hand, still fixed. Eric looked down at the hand. You're supposed to shake. What's your name? He turned from the screen to grab Eric's arm and take the shake from his hand. My name is Eric. Do you like Daffy Duck? Yes. Do you like him better than Bugs Bunny? I don't know. Todd looked at him like a child scholar at a child Philistine. What other shows do you like? I don't know. Todd looked over again with the same condescending glare. Eric's eyes were now fixed on the screen. Children can be cruel. Their evaluations and judgments are concise and at times unjust. Acceptance and alienation ride a fine line and can be based on the arbitrary. Todd's evaluation of Eric could very well have fallen in either irreparable direction. Through factors and criteria incomprehensible by adult standards, Todd had made an immediate decision about Eric. He knew right away how things were going to go. He liked Eric right from the start. The two were immediately inseparable. Eric's integration into their home had gone better than Irma could have dreamed. Almost a month had passed before Ted, the weathered construction foreman, and Barry, the multi-athletic 14-year-old, had said more than 2 words to their new resident. The old dogs were predictably territorial. She took comfort knowing that Eric had found a home with her and with Todd. Their friendship worked because Todd enjoyed having a sidekick. And Eric, as always, was accommodating. He learned quickly to laugh when Todd laughed and jump when he jumped, and to always let him win. Todd, leader of every neighborhood gang and captain of every softball team, relished having someone to protect and cultivate. His knowledge of stone skipping and slingshot building and spit throwing was too valuable not to be imparted. Eric's trademark glare of mild confusion melted in Todd's presence. When he was with Todd, he knew what was expected of him. He knew how to act. It was easy. He just copied Todd. Despite Todd's revered status among their schoolmates, little of the limelight crossed Eric's shoulder. His acceptance only existed as an extension of his foster brother. When not by his side, others prodded and ridiculed Eric, trying somehow to usurp his role as the right-hand man. Eric never thought to bring his social problems to Todd. He didn't quite comprehend the motives or the intention of the insults. Mostly they failed to bother him. In addition, Eric was starting to fall behind in school. As predicted, the higher level of third-grade curriculum, literature, and advancing mathematics was not penetrating. Mrs. Danvers visited the school repeatedly, pleading to keep Eric in the regular program. She knew the special education program's label would strain his and Todd's relationship and thus his development. Fortunately, Eric's excellent capacity for retention and good behavior kept him in the teacher's favor and therefore, for the time being, in the regular classroom. One snowy December afternoon, a week before the Christmas break, Todd was held behind after a class for his normal tomfoolery. Mrs. Hoskins reprimanded her charming young troublemaker while he labored away at cleaning the brushes and the chalkboard. As her pacing and lecturing took her up and down the classroom, he saw through the small window a figure alone in the blowing snow outside the school's front door. She watched the figure for a moment, aghast that it refused to move in the unbearable cold. "Eric, is that you?" "Yes." "What are you doing?" Her anxious tone bordered on anger. "I'm waiting." His face refused to cringe, being smacked by the bitterly cold wind. "Get inside! Come in, you silly thing! What are you waiting for?" "Todd?" "He'll be here a while, dear. You can't wait for him today. It's too cold. Go home, okay? Mrs. Danvers must be worried." Eric always obeyed. Past the playground, there was a path that quickly took him down a laneway behind a strip mall and onto their street. Mrs. Danvers was uncomfortable with them taking the shortcut, but Todd assured her several times that it was cool. Behind the strip mall, there was a common hangout for Todd's gang. The mall dumpsters and recycling offered an endless supply of discarded department store treasures. Eric walked calmly with his head slowly examining the world covered in snow. Their hangout was a shelter from the blowing snow, and Eric could see a couple of his sometime cohorts arguing over ownership of their newest treasure. They looked up at Eric walking through the gathering snow by himself and immediately lost interest in their bauble. They menacingly closed in on him when it became evident that he wasn't going to approach them. They smiled and scowled at the same time. He looked back at them as though he prepared for a question. These two particular boys had made their opinions of Eric clear many times. He knew they didn't like him, but wasn't sure then what was required of him. They had nothing to say. Their actions would speak. Todd had finished his punishment about 5 minutes after Eric had left. He rushed across the playground and down the path, both to minimize his time in the cold and his time away from Bugs Bunny. He came upon the three boys almost immediately after their assault had started. One boy straddled Eric's chest, his knees pinning his arms back. He punched and slapped Eric's face while the other hovered and laughed, occasionally heaving a kick into Eric's sides and legs. Taunts and insults were escalating as the attack failed to force forth any desired pleas or tears. Just as the boy on top brought his arm back for his hardest punch, his own face popped sideways from Todd's fist. Intimidation had already driven the other boy back. Todd heaved the boy from Eric's chest and tackled him, assuming the boy had just held. The reaction from the boy craved from Eric now poured from his own face. He turned to watch the boy cry and plead with his own usual blank melancholy. He watched Todd's anger plateau, different from the look of pleasure on the boy who sat over him. Todd didn't say a word during the entire exchange, or for the rest of the walk home. Eric didn't say thank you and didn't know he had to. Todd's expression mixed severity with repressed pride. Eric learned something that day. Chapter 7. Eventually it was decided that Eric could no longer stay with the regular school program. Mrs. Danvers was more comfortable with the change coming in the 7th grade. Many of the classes varied for both boys, so Eric's special classes didn't have to interfere with their friendship. Todd's friendships were becoming more deliberate. He had friends from his sports teams, from classes, female friends who could get him things, and friends he didn't even like if they weren't present. Eric noticed how Todd's face and voice changed among every group. Eric preferred to observe rather than join. Eric became known simply as Todd's foster brother when he was once known as his sidekick. The time that Todd made for Eric was fleeting. He had less time and patience for his foster brother by the day. Where it was once fulfilling to have a follower, having a constant tag-along was becoming a burden. Nearing 13, Todd was starting to develop a more adult persona, and that persona was an individual. Though he often resented Eric's presence, a soft spot remained on the back of his heart for his solitary friend. He was careful to distance himself from him in the eyes of his socially elite friends while defending him cautiously. At least he did for the time being. Todd had all but lost his interest in cartoons. His hobbies all revolved around sports, much like his older brother. Every sport that he added to his roster he mastered within moments of learning the rules. Eric tried to keep up, but couldn't hope to match Todd's natural ability. There was a competitive fuel in Todd that Eric lacked. Competition supplied Todd with his edge. Eric could never be spurned to victory by the fire in his opponent's eyes. He was content to watch Todd from the sidelines. There were a select few sports that Todd had the patience to engage in with Eric. Mountain biking was one of those few pastimes. It was something they could share and explore without points, trophies, or a finish line. Todd had a favorite trail. It started behind their school and worked its way up through the hills on the outskirts of town. The path was a well-worn hiking trail, complete with rest areas and lookout points. It gave them a sense of security, every tree and every turn that welcomed them on their trip. In an effort to escape the growing monotony with which Eric seemed perfectly comfortable, Eric directed his bike down the incline of a poorly worn footpath through the thick of the forest. His eyes glared black at Eric with glitter. Instinctively, Eric reciprocated the look. Eric could hear Todd grunting and wheezing with glee as he directed the wheels of the bike over and around the numerous natural obstacles. Eric mimicked Todd's every nimble maneuver. It was by the virtue of his talent for copying his foster brother that he was able to negotiate the difficult terrain. Todd's excitement grew as the incline steepened, and then climbed into the woods. Every few minutes, his sparkling glee shot back at his happy follower. He enjoyed that a moment had grown between them that they hadn't shared in months. He enjoyed that he liked the company of Eric again. For the moment, his best friend wasn't a burden, and that pleased him. The wooded terrain surrendered to rocks and granite as they continued along their newly discovered path. Neither realized they had made it so far through the forest to the bluffs. Todd could remember watching a more experienced rider pounding up and down the trails as he struggled on foot with his father. His ambition was ready for this challenge, but his experience and his cohort were not. Their ears and eyes adjusted as the environment changed from trees to rock, and sensual stimuli flooded them in the open air. Pebbles that bounced down the cliff when their tires got too close to the edge chimed in their heads. Adrenal fury pushed Todd up and down the trails with growing momentum. Eric's concentration remained focused on Todd's rear tire. Challenges were Todd's fuel. He would learn the best time in a recent race or the high statistic from a sport and forego all else until he attained or surpassed the benchmark. The mountain trail was one of these challenges. He knew that the difficulty was above his level, but with every turn, climb, and dip, he saw the trail becoming his. He forgot about safety or pain. He forgot Eric was closing in behind him. All he could recall was his goal. As the young boy forced the mountain bike he planned to conquer, the scenery over the next ridge bounced through his eyes and calmed his adrenaline. He hadn't realized how high they had climbed. The entire town lay before him as a miniature of what they once knew. He looked to the trail ahead in time to see that it came to an end at the approaching stream. The stream trickled forward to a nearby cliff and poured into an impressive waterfall. The adrenaline electrocuted back through his system as he pulled desperately on the brakes. Black rubber bounced along the gravel and rock to a halt at a safe distance from the cliff overlooking the creek, fed by the falls that rolled into the forest. Awe and pride recaptured Todd as he absorbed his victory of the mountain. Their bikes would take him no further, but there was nothing left to conquer. His moment was broken as Eric charged up behind him. He'd heightened his pace to keep up. Todd knew the moment he turned around that Eric would not have enough room to stop. Eric was enjoying Molly's spaghetti. His diet rarely ventured past sandwiches and soup. "Do you like it, Eric?" He nodded with satisfaction, his face gobbling away, hovering just over the dish. Molly wanted to hear more about Mrs. Danvers. She was interested in any and all aspects of Eric's past, but was careful not to pry. Knowing that Eric had once had a generous foster mother who enjoyed cooking for him would be enough for now. He hoped that one day she would learn more about Mrs. Danvers' son. She could sense the special area in Eric's heart that he occupied. The moment at the cliff passed far too quickly. Shock kept Todd from commanding Eric to break in time. A scream of disbelief made its way to his lips as the careening bicycle, spitting rocks from its halted tires, tumbled over the edge of the cliff. Todd's hand reached out in vain for Eric, who was already far from his grasp. He threw his bike to the ground and with a hasty reluctance peered over the edge. He saw the bike first, 50 feet below, its tires still spinning on its side of the creek bed. He scanned beneath for his friend. Eric was face down on a grouping of rocks at the base of the waterfall. A second scream of disbelief involuntarily burst forth. Eric's body hung limply on the jagged boulders. The mortal image froze his mind as the strength left his legs and he fell backward onto his rear, all the while unable to retract his eyes from his motionless friend. His body was flat against the rocks, like a two-dimensional image. Just as his mind began to accept the truth of the image before him and manage the burden of the consequences that flooded him, his brain again recoiled. Trying to clear his vision through the tears that had grown in his eyes, Todd struggled to understand a twitch that he noticed from Eric's left hand. Despair had just begun to lower its weight on his shoulders and accept ultimate loss. His panic came to a jarring halt as a new belief molted from his face. Eric's hands put their palms down and raised his torso off the rocks. Todd bounced to his feet with elation choking his throat. Eric stood, shook his head just slightly, and calmly found his way to his feet. He looked about in a spell of brief disorientation. Soon his eyes found their way back up to Todd's. Todd's eyes didn't return the expected expression. In the span of a couple of minutes, Todd had experienced the most vivid emotions in all their extremities. Adrenal victory had been replaced with abysmal despair. That despair was quickly shifted into elation. Seeing Eric rise from the rocks, alive and from what Todd could see completely unscathed, began then to stun his brief rush of glee. As Eric recovered his bicycle from the creek and started up toward the path, Todd scanned him furiously for an injury or some evidence of the fall. Without knowing it, Todd was searching for a reassurance of his humanity. He knew that walking away from that fall without blood and bruises was impossible. He could see through the tears that the enormity of the moment, that logic dictated some unhappy findings. Todd felt betrayed by the knowledge that he wasn't right. It wasn't right that Eric was all right. Eric didn't know what to think of Todd's peculiar probing stare. He looked up and down his body repeatedly, almost angrily. Todd had been frustrated with Eric many times before. He'd become quite accustomed to Todd's displeasure. This look was different. It was suspicious and intimidated. Eric had never seen this look and didn't know how to respond. Eric had developed a talent for producing the reactions he believed were expected of him. He could never have imagined that what Todd expected from him in that moment. Todd didn't say a word aloud on their trek back home. He looked back only once to monitor Eric. Eric did his best to follow as always. He failed to associate Todd's newly somber tone to his fall only minutes earlier. He'd fallen off his bicycle many times before and failed to even consider the significance of the fall that should have killed him. He could never have dreamed that he was supposed to rise uninjured. The surreal experience drove a spur into their weakened friendship. Though what Todd had witnessed was something he never shared with anyone, was an image that never dissipated. As time passed, he allowed the peculiarity of the event to be overshadowed by his growing disdain for Eric. What stood out in his memory was that his brother was the wrong kind of different. People fear what they don't understand. It's an instinct derived from self-preservation that's bolstered and cultivated by the discriminating epidermal layer of society and the influences that teach us about alignment and opposition. Somewhere between sponge-like acceptance of a child and the realization that our parents aren't perfect, we learn about categories and labels. We learn to accept and reject the favorable and the unpleasing. Though we spend our lives determining and redefining the criteria constantly, we understand as children, right about Todd's age, to align and oppose. Choose things and people that we like and dislike, to make it known what we stand for, whom we stand with, and whom we stand against. Most people learn to disdain before they learn tolerance. If we can't understand, then we certainly can't relate. And if it's not with us, it's got to be against us. What Todd had experienced was more than any kid should have to go through. Todd saw something more than different, more than frightening, the day he saw Eric rise to his feet on that creek bed far below him. He saw something that couldn't exist in the world he knew. Something that defied all he'd accepted in his pre-teenage conception of morality. Eric was suddenly something he couldn't understand. Chapter 8. As he watched Molly busy herself in his kitchen, cleaning his dishes and wiping the counter, he quietly pondered to himself why she was doing these things for him. He felt certain that it would have been impolite to ask. Their after-dinner discussion consisted of Molly further probing Eric's background. She was still anxious about asking too much, but knew that conversation was not one of Eric's strengths. So do you work? No. Then how do you afford this nice apartment? My lawyer pays for it. Your lawyer? Though he presented him his answers quite matter-of-factly, he could now sense her confusion. My lawyer takes care of my money. The money that Dr. Harmon left me. Eric was patient and generous as Molly attempted to maintain a level of conversation through her gentle interviewing. He was oblivious to the delicate state that Molly now found herself in as the dialogue survived on life support. He didn't know he was supposed to help her keep up the chit-chat. As the spaces between awkward moments shrank with every passing minute, Molly soon remembered her early morning duties at the store. Feeling somewhat defeated by what she felt was insufficient progress with her reserved dinner partner, she adjourned to the kitchen and with a visible level of disappointment. Eric watched quietly from the living room as she gathered her things. He remembered his manners at the last possible moment, moving for the door to graciously see her out. Thanks for dinner, Molly. It was very good. I liked getting to know you a little better. Eric looked into her face and produced the most pleasant smile in his repertoire. He wondered why she held her smile at him for those extra few seconds. It was different than the smile that normally welcomed him into her store. The moment soon passed, and Molly again felt somewhat defeated. Good night, Eric. She touched his forearm softly, the tips of her fingers, and turned and started for the stairs. His eyes followed her down the hallway. He didn't shut the door until she was out of sight. Todd's dislike of Eric grew over time as the awkward teenager steadfastly remained loyal and attentive to his dominant foster brother. Things happen to adolescents that no book can define and no adult can quite understand or empathically recollect. In a microcosm of the adult world that awaits them, teens make choices happily free and quite alien to the realms of logic and rational thought. No one could explain Todd's intolerance to his foster brother. Everyone assumed that what was once an apprehension of Eric's social deficiencies had grown into outright disgust and embarrassment. Eric had grown to recognize Todd's need for space, but even he was unaware of the root of Todd's disgust. In the first 3 years of high school, Eric had hardly spoken to another student. Superficially, Eric had a lot to be desired. Popular jeers at his expense described him as not having seen a mirror in years. In truth, he never looked into a mirror the way others did. He didn't have the capacity to obsess about his appearance like most high school students, like Todd. The high school lives of Todd and Eric had taken drastically different paths. Todd had a finger in every competitive and social pie, finding time for all the sports, all the parties, and all the girls that squealed his name. He started to learn that his position of achievement and modest teenage reverence had its amenities. He had come to enjoy being cool. At 16, Eric still rarely missed what was once their favorite cartoons. His constant, quiet contentment left no room for ambition or desire. He didn't have even the slightest social interest, which at an age of necessary belonging is rare. He didn't seem to be anything that would spark his interest outside of his heavily regimented routine. He existed without any endeavor. He barely maintained a passing average in his classes. Despite having a flawless attendance record and an attentive demeanor, his teachers would always complain that he just seemed to be indifferent. Eric, listen to me. The morning sun was brilliant on their first day of high school. Todd brought his brisk walk to a halt, turning Eric, who followed closely. High school is different, Eric. I don't want you following me around. Eric's face shook slightly with confusion, but stayed placid. Todd didn't know if he was getting through, so he turned up the volume. Don't talk to me, Eric, because I won't talk to you. It hurt both of them somehow, but it was getting through. We're not friends here, he almost bellowed into Eric's calm, plain face. Do you get it? Todd was confident he understood as he looked at Eric's dumbfounded stance. They never walked to school together again. Though Eric didn't understand the finer points of high school social hierarchy as the years passed, he did recognize what made him different from Todd's friends. He could see that they were all good-looking and outgoing. He heard them all tell the same jokes, and he saw they wore the same clothes. He saw that they all played a role with very strict parameters. He respected them all for their sustained endurance as performers. His place was as an observer. It was a position he was content to occupy. But most importantly, he was told to stand on the sidelines by Todd, and he was willing to obey. Lately, his awareness had been growing more acute. The shiver that seemed to accompany strange behavior and actions in others was becoming more fervent than he could ignore and far more accurate than a coincidence. It was telling him something, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. In addition, he was again forced to face another situation where he didn't get injured the way he was supposed to. It happened as he was helping Mrs. Danvers prepare dinner one afternoon. Acting as an assistant cook was one of the daily rituals that both he and his foster mother treasured. The necessary preparations of salad and baking were complete. Thus, the well-trained Eric had begun washing the available pots and pans. Mrs. Danvers had started cleaning the counter in her furious manner as dinner time quickly approached. Her arm waved out vigorously as she swept the clutter into a pile, without noticing her elbow connected with the blender, which had been placed precariously close to the sink. Eric watched it topple slowly before it fell into the water where his hands were immersed. Something told him of the urgency of the moment, but he failed to react immediately. A shorting circuit sparked from the wall outlet, attracting Mrs. Danvers' attention. With a short scream, she bounced toward Eric, who then realized what should have been happening. Their eyes met, and he let out a moderate, artificial scream. He threw himself from the counter, pulling a second scream from Mrs. Danvers' throat. She ran over to him with a whimper, mumbling with restrained tears, asking if he was okay. He opened his eyes immediately, and with a second attempt at acting, used a weary voice to assure her he was fine. She returned to the sink for a damp cloth. Eric's eyes widened and roamed around the room as awareness washed over him. Aside from forgettable instances, nothing of the like had happened since he fell into the ravine years before. The astounding notion he now found himself stranded in gave new meaning to the significance of that day. He was now seeing what Todd saw. He was mature enough now to disbelieve. His mind wrapped and wrinkled around something that could have happened. He looked at his hand. It showed no sign of electrical burn and felt something akin to what Todd must have felt when he climbed up from that creek bed. The thought had a similar origin with a far different destination. He knew immediately this fear wouldn't go away. That blame and rejection was an easy exit he wouldn't be afforded. The freak would never leave. The thing he could never understand was always going to be there, staring back at him in the mirror. Being different was something he was always conscious of. It was an instinct that entered his brain as easily as his awareness of his own fingers and toes. Until that day in the springtime, it was a notion without a reason, without a formula. Suddenly, the factor that kept him alone had a composition, an answer that burned in the back of his head every time he was left behind. Some questions are best left as questions. Chapter 9. Amidst the droves of pre-adults struggling with emerging identities, be it jock, geek, nerd, winner, or loser, there are always three distinct tiers. Those that want to be, those that are, and the others who don't care. The members of the first group always desire a change, while the members of the second often fear one. Jacob Williamson was one of the ones who wanted to be. In Jacob's case, he needed to be. Jacob was one of those poor souls plagued with an insecurity that he decided to hide behind bravado. He required the acceptance of others to validate himself, at a degree greater than most. He had decided early on that in the adolescent social structure, he needed to be cool. He needed to run with the in crowd and look down on those who weren't worthy. What differentiated him from someone like Todd was that it didn't come naturally. Jake wasn't a leader or an achiever like the others in his circle of friends. He didn't draw people to him by means of a magnetic spirit or a charming persona. He had to be far more Machiavellian in his pursuit and retention of social grandeur. The football change room wasn't the same without Jake's obnoxious presence. The guys found it strange how empty the room felt without Jake bellowing obscenities about someone's mother or the latest racially insensitive humor. Football players are creatures of ritual, and Todd, along with the others, was discovering that strapping on his pads required that ignorantly loud compliment. A part of all of them wanted Jake back, but he wasn't coming back, even though he was there in the room with them, quietly suiting up in the far corner. Things had changed recently for Jake in a most dreadful way. "What the hell is this?" Their lips broke away from one another, and their eyes shot back to the doorway. Their two faces shared the same helplessly guilty expression. They never considered being caught. His friend and his girlfriend. Todd always threw the best parties, and rarely had time to venture upstairs. "Todd! Shit. Hold on. It's not what you think." "Screw you, Jake. It's exactly what I see." Todd watched their expressions change expectedly. Sarah shrunk and dropped in embarrassment, while Jake expanded in his ever-blooming defense. Jake wanted anything that once belonged or still belonged to Todd. It was his way of emerging from his shadow and standing in his shoes, even if just for a moment. A flurry of explanations and excuses flew at Todd like blowing snow. She was sad. We were just talking. I've had too much to drink. This will never happen again. She asked me to do it. Oh, shit. I'm really, really, really sorry. Todd had the will and the means to punish them both. Those few seconds standing in the doorway of the crime scene, actually Eric's bedroom, were Todd's moments of deliberation. Moments were all he needed to make his decision. Just get the hell out, both of you. Todd saw Jake raise his hands for a final plea, but could hear nothing in his rage. He grabbed Jake's sweater over the left shoulder and led him out of the room. Once in the hallway, his adrenaline heaved Jake down the first short flight of stairs. He turned back to Sarah, who stared at him with the finest blend of fear and sex and surrender that she could muster in her limited experience. He shook his head and glared at her, void of sympathy or regret. I said, "Get out." At Todd's parties, the standing rule for Eric was to stay out of the way. He was happy to float about the fringe and observe as always. From out on the front lawn, Eric saw Sarah and Jake chatting in the living room and then adjourn upstairs. He sensed they were working at deception, but had learned nothing less than a fleet of police cars warranted disturbing Todd. He saw Jake tumble down the stairs and Todd follow soon after. He stepped back into the shadows by the side of the porch as the front door swung open. The rest of Todd's friends gathered behind as he forced Jake from the property without letting him get to his feet. All present knew that he was being ejected from more than just the party. Desperately scanned the faces in front of him for sympathy, but all staunchly stood with Todd. They always stood with Todd. Jacob's lifestyle changed significantly over the weeks that followed. The hallways of the high school looked vastly different, with his eyes kept low, when his head used to be held high. The high school grapevine has an efficiency that greatly outshines any other known communications network. Groups that used to welcome him into their conversation now kept their backs to him as he approached. The look of intimidation he once instilled in those perceived to be his lessers was gone. He tried once or twice to act as though nothing had changed, but was glared at by like a stranger, by those he so recently called friends. He couldn't stand the feeling within his own skin. Every morning he woke up not knowing who he was or who he was supposed to be. The best he could figure was to act normal, conduct business as usual. He hoped with every fiber within him that his world would soon turn right side up. "Eric, how's it going?" "So, buddy, what's new?" "I'm fine, Jacob. Nothing is new. How are you?" Eric noted that this was the most Jake had ever said to him consecutively. He also noted that the tone was notably more pleasant than condescending. "I'm cool, you know." Jake didn't know that a brave front was useless with Eric. He could sense the fake bravado, though he couldn't quite comprehend the tragedy of his situation. "So, how's Todd? I guess he hasn't talked about me." "No. You know how he and I... Well, anyway, could you do me a favor?" Though he couldn't quite understand the origin or purpose, he sensed the peculiarity of Jake's behavior. He knew immediately that it had to do with the events at the party, but couldn't fathom how he could be helpful, and to what end. "Yes, Jake. What can I do for you?" Could you tell me if... Just tell Todd..." Eric could see Jake's mind bending. He wanted to say so much, but surrender so little. "Just tell Todd you talked to me and I was doing fine." The pain of rejection was altering Jake's longing into malice. Eric observed Jake as the observer. He no longer seemed to hover on the periphery like a family dog in the cold. His stance was now far more distant, yet twice as intense. When Eric caught his eye directly, something cold scraped at the back of his neck. Football practice was a daily autumn spectacle for Eric. The after-school practices were somehow more interesting to Eric than the actual games. Though the crowds in the stands and the energy pulsating around the field at the games offered more in the way of excitement, the practices to him seemed more complete. The young men would run drills and scrimmages, manufacturing the drive that poured out in the big games. The outlay of strength and emotion was something he enjoyed observing because he was unable to conjure it within himself. He also preferred practice because, unlike the games, every player sought a common goal rather than two warring tribes seeking a one-sided victory. As the alienation grew between him and his former teammates, Jake's patience for the afternoon practice shrank by the day. A different kind of solidarity pulsated through the young men at practice than normally did at their games. Where glory pumped blood through their hearts at the big game, a desire to better their dynamic fueled their energy every day after school. It was the strength of their brotherhood that gave them the drive to improve. Jake was no longer part of that brotherhood, at least in the way he once was. Practices had become a daily reminder of his rejection. He stewed and bubbled as he bashed and tumbled among the boys he once called his friends. Studying Jake had become a frequent pastime for Eric. Since their brief chat, he took particular notice to the way he moped through the halls when he thought no one was watching. His congeniality seemed to stretch further than it did before. He laughed at jokes that were once beneath him and paid attention to people he previously had no time for. He spoke with a more diminutive tone and stalled at the proper moments so he would walk home safely alone. For the observer, football practice offered the purest example of the effects of Jake's banishment. When a new play found its perfect execution and their machine found order, the boys always enjoyed a round of congratulation for one another. They would slap and clap and whistle and cheer, exchanging high fives and well-placed vulgarities, as one ostracized figure would trot around outside with his head downward, waiting for the celebration to end. Coach Watson called their newest defensive play the hummingbird. It sent two men from the defensive line at the unguarded quarterback. Players rarely could understand how the coach found names for his plays. Jake was one of the defense to advance on Todd following the snap. In the few seconds as both the lines crouched into position, Jake labored over whether he would take this opportunity to show Todd his mettle or show his mercy. His mind raced as the helmets around him huffed and puffed, waiting for the call to strike. With Todd's command, the two lines soon collided into one another and moved into the square dictated by their strategy. Jake heaved his way through the line at Todd. Couldn't remember if he had reached a logical decision a moment before, as his broken heart drove him into his former friend like a locomotive. Connected with his target with far more force than practice scrimmage required, and they came to the ground with a combined moan and groan. The play was a success. "You piece of shit!" Todd slammed Jake's helmet with the ball as he was still in his hand. It was more than Todd had said to him directly in weeks. He didn't say it in the way he once would have, the way friends curse at each other. Jake rose to see the disapproving glare of his teammates blazing at him amidst under-breath comments and shaking heads. Even Coach failed to acknowledge the execution of his new play, instead turning about in a veiled cursed words. Eric's face held its empathetic wince for both boys as the line set up for another play. As the line set up, Todd saw the chance to do what leaders like him tend to do: assert his dominance. The alpha male brought his team into its frenzied melee with his command and took his 2 steps back. He watched the receiver charge down the field and move into position. Then he peered down to see Jake's head come into view. His face came up just as Todd cocked back to throw. Before he could react, Todd launched his space-bound projectile straight into Jake's face. The blow and surprise threw Jake's head and body backward to the ground. This time as he rose, the reception was warmer, but 1,000 times more painful. Bellowing, ridiculing laughter bludgeoned bruises into his flesh that football padding could not hope to protect him from. A frigid, painful fear ran through Eric to his extremities. As the laughter subsided and the lions came together a third time, Jake's heated mind was rattling, pulsing with thoughtless energy. His heavy breathing grew as the rush approached. Focus on Jake's line was interrupted as his wheezing grew to a subsonic whine that emanated from his heart like a pouting child. Without a recognizable thought, but a clear motive, Jake burst from the line a split second before the snap. A cold rush threw Eric to his feet as the whistle blew and Jake connected with an unsuspecting Todd on his right flank. The ruthless strike flattened Todd as Jake continued his charge into the grass and dirt. The immensity of the blow knocked the breath from Todd's body before he could release a groan or a whimper. A group of angry hands ripped Jack from his victim to find Todd face down and motionless in the cold, damp grass. The baffled and bewildered group waited hopelessly for movement, none of them noticing Eric standing among them. His eyes widened more with every movement, bolting through the thoughts that stormed his brain. Todd still didn't move. No one noticed Jake scuttle off the field during the ensuing panic. Following Todd being rushed to the hospital, fewer saw Eric long after, standing alone over the spot where Todd had lay. Thank you for listening to part 3 of The Hero Business. If you like this story so far and you want more, or you feel compelled to throw your support in this direction, the fastest route is through my website, patrickhughes.ca. There you'll find access to my other projects, links to my books and ebooks on various platforms, and a contact me function. You can also lend your valuable support by liking and subscribing and sharing on whatever platform you're visiting. It really makes a difference. Please add your voice with a click if you like what you hear. I hope you share this. Please don't keep good fiction a secret. Thanks so much.